Good morning, everybody. First of all, let me say how sorry that I am not here with you today. I was very much looking forward to this conference. It was going to be my first visit to your part of the world. But not only that, I know you're an extremely active group of scholars, and I know that I would have been able to learn quite a lot from you, so I would have rather been in Lagos, sitting there now, listening to you. You see on the screen that I have adopted the title of the conference also as the title of my presentation. So, Pragmatics and Mediated Communication. Now, in fact, my opening sentence, where I said something like, "I'm sorry I am not here now," well, that illustrates what pragmatics is all about. The way in which linguistic choices can be played around with to fit a situation. A sentence like, "I am not here now," can never be literally true at the place and time when and where it is spoken. Still, you will know exactly, precisely what it is that I mean. And in fact, my absence from this conference illustrates the role of mediated communication. Well, okay, so there is this virus that spreads, and it gets into the news. The virus itself certainly calls for certain types of measures, but the fear that is created communicatively forces measures that seem disproportionate and may not be so effective after all. Now, part of the mediated communication is also the emergence of conspiracy theories. So one of the theories in connection with the coronavirus, for instance, says that Chinese Muslims infected high-ranking Chinese politicians when visiting a mosque, and they would have done so because of reasons of revenge for being maltreated in China, and so on. Now, this is a kind of communication that leads a life of its own, and I experienced the other day in a discussion with a neighbor of mine how far this goes. So this neighbor of mine was very much convinced of the fact that Muslims were responsible for the outbreak of the coronavirus. And he said, as a piece of evidence that he said, well, just look at the world map. Why doesn't it spread in Muslim countries? And, well, what he had forgotten was that one of the worst affected countries in the world is Iran, and that Iran can hardly be regarded as a non-Islamic country. Now, the point is that, in fact, all public debates, if not all forms of communication, are forms of mediated communication, and what always plays a role in this is ideology. And so, for instance, in this case, in the example that I gave, it's not only ideas about health that come into play, it is ideas related to negative views of Islam, related to recent events in the world. It's also related to a very general culture of fear that somehow seems to characterize quite a lot of what's going on in the world, and that does seem to serve certain kinds of political purposes. Now, what I mean by ideology, and I will very briefly give a definition here because I will have to refer back to it on a couple of occasions later on in this talk. What I mean is very simply any basic pattern of meaning or habitual frame of interpretation bearing on or involved in an aspect of social reality. Now, the main things to remember from that definition is that it's all about, first of all, that it's all about meaning, which is why this is not only of interest to linguists, but also why linguists can contribute to its analysis. Second thing to remember is that this is about frames of interpretation, and the frames of interpretation in question are the habitual ways of thinking and speaking about an aspect of social reality. The topic for, well, this is of course the topic for a lecture in its own right, and I do not have the time for that. But as I said, I will have to refer to this once or twice later on in this talk. So let's now have a look at what the rest of this lecture is going to look like. First of all, I will be saying something about pragmatics in general, and specifically in its relationship with meaning, for which I use the term meaning potential here. Then I will go to mediated communication, so the second part of my title and the second part of the title of your conference. And first of all, I will draw the attention to the normality of mediated communication and then go on to some of the specificities. And finally, I will come up with an example that is derived from a specific area of public discourse related to the question of offense in public discourse. Now, language use, the field of linguistic pragmatics, is essentially a matter of interactive generation of meaning. Meanings get generated in the use of language. Now, for a very long time, within linguistic pragmatics, as the study of language use, what has been dominant is Paul Grice's notion of non-natural meaning, for which you see the definition on the screen there, namely the speaker's intention in the making of an utterance to produce an effect in the hearer by means of the hearer's recognition of the intention to produce that effect. In this definition, this is very interesting to look at, in this definition, meaning, as it were, gets detached from language by getting located in individual intentionality. But if you think about this, the meaning that is interactively generated is not only the product of intentionality. So for instance, my intention in presenting this lecture, my intentions do not fully determine your interpretations. And what is more, this talk would not even be a success if they did. To the extent that I'm trying to raise some interesting questions, I cannot fully grasp all the implications which the utterances I am producing have for you, my audience, and not because you would misunderstand, no, but simply because of the very concrete setting. For one thing, we do not share time. What I am saying now for you is in fact what I said yesterday, which is now for me at the time of speaking. We also do not share space, so we are really very far apart now, thousands of kilometers. We also have different theoretical, academic, experiential backgrounds, so that your interpretations may shed a quite different light on things I am trying to talk about, different from what I have in mind. But then that expression is already a careless formulation on the dangerous assumption that what is in my mind would be very clear ideas, rather than a mix of ideas and what some people would call impressions. Therefore, once we have started to detach meaning from language by placing it in individual intentionality, we are not able to avoid, conceptually and theoretically, to even further detach meaning from language by fully recognizing the role of context, allowing for processes of meaning generation far removed from individual intentionality. Methodologically, however, if we want meaning to remain an empirical object of investigation in spite of the intangible nature of many of its constitutive forces, there is a need for reattaching meaning to language or linguistic form. Central to the recipe for doing this is the notion of contextual indexing. We must be able to look for observable traces betraying the specific ways in which language users orient to selected aspects of context. If we manage to do that, it becomes possible to replace the question, what did language user X intend utterance Y to mean in context C? To replace that question with another question, namely, what is the meaning of utterance Y in context C? But this reformulation of the question can only work if meaning is interpreted as meaning potential. And now I have to explain briefly why we really need this focus on meaning potentiality. Perhaps the most flattering thing that can be said about human beings is that they are meaning-making machines. So interactively generating meanings by means of language, it relies on three abilities. And the first one of those abilities is the ability to capture the world in categories. Even though the world is highly structured in itself, if we start looking at the nuts and bolts, it first appears to us as a relatively under-differentiated blur of meaning-making potential. In our interaction with this world, we develop cognitive and perceptual differentiation by using our ability to capture it in categories, to which we tend to link words. And it is those categories connected with words that form the basic ingredients of the patterns of meaning and frames of interpretation that constitute what I referred to as ideology earlier in this lecture. Now, many categories may seem to be quite trivial. So if you look at the little picture on your screen, so okay, there is a world that consists of squares and triangles and circles, but not all of reality is so simple. So most of social reality, for instance, is much more complicated. And then the range of options that we have available to categorize people and events in the real world, in the social world, well, the way in which we categorize these things, well, most of the time, and the words we use for that, most of the time, they are very non-trivial. So it matters, for instance, in a context of migration, whether you refer to people as strangers, foreigners, migrants, refugees, illegal aliens, all these names that you give to a category of people have different implications and lead to different ways of treating people. So categorization is not a trivial kind of phenomenon. Then there is a second ability that we invoke to try and understand, which is to try and understand the relations between categorized entities, which we can then go on to conceptualize in terms of states or events, for the description of which we have evolutionarily developed a bunch of useful linguistic tools, quote-unquote grammar. You can describe the same kinds of phenomena in the world in terms of different conceptual scenes, thanks to the use of this grammar that allows us to relate, to establish relationships between categorized entities. Sticking to the example of the context of migration for a little while, to give you a couple of examples, you can describe a general state. For instance, you can say the boat is full, and this evokes a specific image. It is a very metaphorical way of saying that there is no place for any further immigrants in our society. And so it's a very common kind of metaphor. You can also use a description that focuses on an incipient event, which is oriented to a new general state. For instance, refugees are flooding the country. You can also use a form of description that, that focuses on an occurrence event. which is without an event without an inherent outcome. A sentence example would be, in most European countries, foreigners have access to extensive support. Or you can make it a directionality event oriented towards another event. Refugees seek the extensive support they can get in most European countries. Now, using the tools developed for describing relations between entities requires a context of interaction in which we must invoke a third ability, the theory of mind, which is the ability to grasp what is happening in other people's heads. This is the very basis of our ability to communicate with language as a tool that leaves more implicit than it makes explicit. So language use always leaves more implicit than it can make explicit. And using language for communicative purposes is only possible thanks to this third ability, the ability to grasp what happens in other people's minds. Now, the result of the application of these three abilities is no longer the initial blur of meaning-making potential. We are really engaged in a dynamic process of making meaning when using our abilities to categorize, to establish relations between categorized entities, and to guess what is in someone else's mind. But there is an important note to make here. And the note is that categories are always approximative, which is, in fact, why lexical fields vary so significantly across languages. But equally approximative is the establishment of relations between categories. And that is why the same state of affairs can always be described in different ways, involving different perspectives. You can even express roughly the same idea either positively or negatively. For instance, I can say, I'm sure the coronavirus will stop spreading, but I can express basically the same idea saying, I'm sure the coronavirus will not keep spreading. Now, when doing so, we may be expressing more or less the same idea, but there is a perspective reversal. And on many occasions, these perspective reversals will have a significant effect on how a piece of discourse really develops. You're approaching the same reality from different angles. Similarly, our ideas about what is happening in someone else's mind are always hypothetical. But we must make hypotheses. We cannot avoid doing so. Otherwise, we do not know where or how to start saying what it is that we want to say. We must decide what we can assume without making it explicit. We must decide what pieces of information can be left in the care of contextual indexing mechanisms, and which ones need to appear in the form of propositional content. As a result of these approximations and hypotheses, the process of meaning-making is highly dynamic, and the product of meaning-making processes is not meaning in any strictly identifiable or fixed sense, but a certain level of meaning potential provided by the affordances of specific linguistic tools. The three abilities referred to enable us to use language in such a way that we can more or less successfully communicate with a variable range of linguistic tools, the meaning of which is largely negotiable in actual use. In other words, they explain the adaptability that is involved. A particularly central aspect of the dynamics of meaning generation, to which I have already been referring on a couple of occasions, is the essential but largely indeterminate interaction of explicit and implicit meaning. And a basic observation in this respect is The observation, on the one hand, the observation of total explicitness, and on the other hand, the expectation of implicitness. Now, this may sound strange, that one would expect implicitness in communication, but the best way to test this is, okay, when you go home and a housemate tells you, I'm tired, then, okay, most of the time you will be very satisfied with that expression and you will know basically what the other person means. But there is a lot that's implicit there, and you can try to make it explicit by asking a question. You can ask, for instance, you're tired? How are you tired? Mentally, physically, or both? And then if you have a very cooperative housemate, he or she may even answer and say something like, well, physically mostly. But then that still leaves a lot implicit, and so you can further ask, well, what does that mean? Do your muscles ache? Do you have trouble standing up? And so on. Well, very soon your questions will no longer be welcome. So you will be told to go to hell now. So that's an illustration of what I mean by the expectation of implicitness. Now, there are related design features of language. So first of all languages use a combination of implicit and explicit meaning, and all languages have structural means for marking implicit meaning. It may seem paradoxical to talk about marking implicit meaning. After all, meaning that is marked cannot be truly implicit, yet the pragmatics literature is full of descriptions of devices that do so, ranging from deictic shifters to presupposition carrying constructions, implication triggering utterances, all the way to unspoken assumptions that are carried along in someone's discourse. All this means is that implicitness, explicitness is necessarily a gradable notion. It is these phenomena that provide, it is the phenomena that are described in this context in the literature that provide, it's these phenomena that provide the contextual indexing that enables our methodologically necessary tracing of language users' orientation to context. Now, once it is passed through the filter of language, which is an inevitable filter in all domains of social life, all human reality, in fact, becomes a form of augmented reality. So augmented reality is not a domain restricted to fiction, even though the uniqueness of human language in comparison with other naturally occurring communication systems may be the fact that it enables us to talk about things that are not real, but merely imagined or invented. Nor is augmented reality restricted to applications of artificial intelligence. No, in the public sphere, for instance, augmented reality is not such a bad characterization of what I referred to earlier as ideology in its most general sense. The sense of the way in which, in a given community, the world is interpreted, or what is, in a given community, regarded as normal. So it's high time now that I get to mediated communication. Now, the way in which we can map meaning potential from a pragmatic point of view is basically always the same for every form of communication, whether or not it is mediated. And it is always wise to treat special cases as if they were just regular or normal. So if somebody asks me how to approach intercultural communication as a phenomenon, then my advice is always, well, first of all, look at it as communication. Because if you try to identify it as something in its own right that is so different that it requires different treatment, you are probably going to be misled. just look at it as communication with all the variables that are always involved in communication, and then you can try to specify which variables are specific for the specific types of communication that you are looking at. And my advice for mediated communication would be exactly the same, namely look at it in the first place as communication. And specific instances differ only with respect to specific parameters along a number of dimensions, but those dimensions are identical. The dimensions that to be looked at are the same dimensions. And that is what I'm trying to show in this slide here. So if you look at the structure of a theory of pragmatics as represented in the diagram in the upper left corner of the screen, then you see that reference, well, that the core of what needs to be done in pragmatics is the study of dynamic processes. That's the very core, that's the center. Processes of meaning making, of meaning generation. Now, but in doing so, you have to make reference to the contextual as well as structural coordinates of the choices that are made in utterance production and in interpretation. And that's what is referred to here as the locus, combination of contextual and structural parameters. And then there is another dimension to be looked at, namely which is labeled salience here, which is a label that stands for the status that the processes occupy in relation to the human mind. And what this comes down to then is the three dimensions that you see at the bottom right corner of the screen, namely context, structure, and salience. Now, salience is in fact the dimension that is related to the third ability that we need for using language, namely the ability to make hypotheses about what is happening in other people's minds. Very importantly, this involves reflexivity or meta-pragmatic awareness. So we constantly monitor our own communication in relation to what we assume about other minds. Now, what must be charted then very carefully for each individual piece of data is aspects of context and aspects of structure. So in terms of contextual aspects in relation to mediated communication, for instance, well, there is a lot there that is shared with other forms of communication, most things that are related to the human context, like social and psychological factors, aspects of a participation framework, and these change from communicative situation to communicative situation and from activity type to activity type. In the case of mediated communication, there is also technology that is involved and which provides its specific affordances. So just think, for instance, about social media with the algorithms that are involved and the bots that can be used for spreading information outside of human agency, in addition to all the specific constellations of human factors that are also still involved. In terms of structural aspects, structural choices are related to the interactional structure, monologic, dialogic, to the availability of space sometimes, to multimodal circumstances, etc. But this is really too much to go into in detail in this lecture, and so, well, there is no time to do all of that. Because literally every possible aspect of context and every possible aspect of structure may become relevant. So what I want to focus on a little more is the dimension of salience. As was said, salience involves reflexivity or meta-pragmatic awareness, and this is always there in every form of communication. But various types of media create additional complexities in the layers of awareness or reflexivity because of, for instance, the less clear-cut boundaries. For instance, in social media, there is not such a clear boundary between public and private. Another factor that is involved is the uncontrolled speed of dispersion. You cannot really control where your messages go and how fast they go there. And so that's why I quote from Wortham and Reyes in this respect. So who say about new media communication that it is usually densely networked, often with many recipients receiving messages and with linkages to other posts through forwarding and quoting. Websites and applications serve as hubs that connect virtual communities and networks. New media communication happens closer to real time than traditional mediated communication, with responses expected more quickly and topics changing rapidly. Now, new media strengthen the need for reflexivity. And they also produce traces of actual reflexivity in the form of chains of comments. So there is a lot of metapragmatic, metalinguistic activity involved, but they make reflexivity also derail faster because of the fuzzy boundaries and the uncontrolled speed. Now, reflexivity that goes into overdrive and that may derail is something that is not restricted to the new media. In public life, we now see various manifestations of how such reflexivity can derail. So if you look, for instance, at politics, the way in which politics is conducted these days, and again I look as an example at migration politics, and I look at the European context, which is the one I'm most familiar with, of course. And if I look back at the policies over the last 50, 60 years, then I see that in the middle of the previous century, the 1950s and the 1960s, the politics was really an economic politics. So immigrants were attracted as a labor force because they were needed for the labor market. In the 1970s, this stopped. But then in the 1980s and 1990s, migration didn't stop, but the politics around it became a juridical politics, namely people who were already in European countries were said to have the right to be reunited with their families, and so families could come over. So it's a different kind of politics. And what, according to the French sociologist François Héran, is happening today, and which is quite an accurate description, I think, is that there is une politique de l'opinion. That means a politics that is geared not towards a consideration of what it is that is actually needed for society, or what is actually needed for people, or what the values and principles are that are involved, but mostly in terms of how people are going to publicly react to certain types of policies, for instance, in their voting behavior. Now, this is a form of reflexivity that is reflexivity in overdrive. But we also see that in other areas. We see it in academia, for instance, where too much work is now being done, not because of the academic content, but because of evaluation processes that require us to publish a certain amount of papers, to publish in specific areas, in specific journals, and so on and so forth. Now, keeping my focus on salience, let me try to give an example in which reflexive commenting on communication has in fact become the very content of communication. So the example comes from work that is in preparation that I'm doing together with colleagues in the University of Queensland, so Michael Hall and Valeria Sinkeviciute, and this has to do with offense in the public sphere. Now, what we observe, the observations we start from are the following. So we observe a harshening of discourse in the public sphere with open attacks on ethnic, cultural minorities, open attacks which are couched in a defense of national identity as a part of the culture wars that are going on. And all of this is justified in terms of speaking the truth, the fight against so-called political correctness, and so on. Then what we also observe is that this has become part of a politicized struggle over the right not to be offended and the right to offend. And an important ingredient is a struggle over the meaning of offense. When does, for instance, humor become offensive? Where does freedom of speech come in? And these two questions tend to get mixed, especially when religion comes in. What is felt to be offensive by X may be intended as humor by Y and defended as a legitimate form of comment or criticism by Z. Now, the specific case that I want to give a few examples from is the following. Israel Folau is a prominent Australian rugby star, and while recovering from an injury, he posts a message on Instagram basically indicating that what happens to you as a human being is simply God's plan, which may differ from yours. So that's what you see in the post that he made originally with your plan, the straight line, God's plan, with all the obstacles that are involved, and then a little quote from the Bible. Now, this message that was posted on Instagram, as usually happens, is responded to. One of the respondents is Mike Sefton, who brings up the topic of homosexuality, to which Folau also responds. That's what's circled in red on the screen. So Sefton, who says, what was God's plan for gay people? And Folau, who answers, hell, unless they repent of their sins and turn to God. What follows then on this one-on-one exchange on internet is a huge amount of discourse, public accessible comments on blogs, internet fora, news media, and so on. And the exchange does not take place in a vacuum because an understanding of the question that is asked, reference must be made to Folau's opposition to same-sex marriage, which is something that was publicly available as information in the Australian context sometime before. However, this remains completely implicit. Nothing of that is said. Then the second thing that is necessary to understand the question is knowledge about Folau's acceptance of a temporary disability to compete as part of God's plan. Now, he is known as a very religious person, so this is not unexpected, and this is made slightly more explicit in this Instagram post, but it's not made fully explicit. Now, much of the discourse that then unfolds is completely structured dynamically around a clear thematic issue. Is Folau's answer to Sefton's question offensive to gay people? Does it display a homophobic attitude? Or is it just the expression of a religiously inspired and legitimate personal opinion? A simple answer to a simple question. What is striking is the density of intertextual metapragmatic references, as in the following example, which says, well, Folau breaks silence over Instagram controversy. The piece, titled I Am a Sinner Too, was the first time Folau had directly addressed the controversy since the initial comment a fortnight ago. Now note that everything that is underlined in that quote, in that piece of discourse, everything is of a metapragmatic nature and is descriptive of discourse. So, predictably, in the discussion that unfolds later, there are two main positions that are voiced in relation to Folau's reply. One position is the position of condemnation or criticism. The other is support and defense. And there is also some attempt at neutrality. Throughout these patterns of meaning-making, the focus on metapragmatic reflexivity really dominates. And just let's look at a few more examples. On the condemnation criticism side, we see something like Australian rugby's highest profile player, Israel Folau, has again courted controversy with a special media comment condemning gay people to hell. While the immediate metapragmatic characterization of Folau's intervention is rather neutral, namely a social media comment, there is implicit criticism here as well, carried, for instance, by the expression courted controversy, which suggests willfulness. Also by the further characterization of Folau's intervention as condemning gay people to hell, which is easily interpretable as showing personal ill will towards gays. Sometimes there is also a multiple layering of voices that is involved. So if you look at the next example, Israel Folau, who said gay people will go to hell unless they repent of their sins, has denied he is a bigot. So here you find a direct quotation from Folau, but this is embedded in a structure indirectly quoting Folau, denying that he is a bigot. This presupposes an external voice accusing him of being a bigot on the basis of the directly quoted piece of discourse, and though this sentence at first sight looks like it takes a neutral position, we know that it probably does not, and later on in the same piece of discourse that becomes very clear. An attempt at neutrality we find in this quote from the organization Rugby Australia, which officially declares that it does not agree with Folau, but at the same time it tries to play it safe. Wallaby superstar Israel Folau has again created controversy on social media after posting a seemingly homophobic Instagram account. Seemingly here clearly leaves open interpretation, and what Folau did was, in these terms, create controversy on social media, and here his role is thus somewhat downplayed, since controversies on social media have many, many actors. There is also support, and support is often phrased in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, aspects of nature, truth, and so on. But within the defense or support league, there is very much the focus on the question that is asked by Septon and which Folau responds to. And this question is usually described as malicious. So in the first quote that you have here, now 6 months later, he is at it again, taking the bait from a not so innocent question on Instagram. And then you may wonder why this question was not so innocent. Well, that is explained in a number of other quotes that I'm showing here, which suggest that he was asked the question, and the question was essentially unrelated to the post that Folau made to begin with. So the unrelatedness of the question to the post that it is supposed to be a comment on, the unrelatedness is seen as a form of provoking, because the questioner, on the basis of his knowledge of Folau's background, would be expected to respond in a way that would cause controversy. And so the question is in fact blamed for the controversy. You have a couple of other quotes here which have exactly the same implications. So a malicious question in the first quote there. And the second one, Folau may have been goaded into making the response by Mike Septon-Poltney, who was trying to get exactly that outcome. Now, it is of course not really possible to give further in-depth analyses in a talk of this kind, so let me just conclude with a couple of very general points. So the reason why I focused specifically on the examples that I gave, the reason also why I focused on the reflexivity and the metapragmatic dimension that is involved, the reason for that is that so much in social life is really very centrally linguistic. Language is central in every domain of social action, and hence it is important to care about and care for language use in the public sphere. Some kind of, it would, well, just imagine that we would be able to contribute by researching all of this, that we could contribute to some kind of an ecology of the public sphere. But of course, we must, before we can do that, we have to understand what happens in communication, whether it is mediated or not. Though the importance of mediated communication grows day by day because of the multiplication of the means of communication. So there is a very important task here for pragmatics as a science of language use. It is also a difficult task because of the intangibility of meaning and the need to keep in mind that it is meaning potential we have to account for, especially in contexts in which no direct meaning negotiation is possible. In face-to-face communication that is possible, but in many forms of mediated communication it is not. Now in this process will be aided in the future, of course, by all kinds of new developments such as computer-aided corpus analysis, certain types of experimental techniques, and so on. But the bottom line is there is a lot of work to be done for the younger generations of linguists, which includes, no doubt, most of you. So let me conclude by saying thank you for listening to this. And if the media technology works as it should, I should now be available for an additional exercise in mediated communication, namely a question-answer session from a very long distance. But again, thank you very much.